Okay, so one last situation where we calculate the rate of change. This time what I'm doing is I'm actually giving you a graph to look at. And so we have a cost situation, right? We're comparing the number of units being made and then the costs in thousands of dollars to make those units. So to find the rate of change, as we've been doing, we have to figure out, well, what are the two changing quantities? And we can kind of see, just again, look at your axes, right? The two changing quantities is cost is changing throughout the situation, and the number of units is changing throughout the situation. So building up a ratio or a fraction, we're going to look at the change in cost versus the change in units. So there's basically our rate of change. So now we got to go figure out, well, how much is the cost changing as we move basically through this graph from point to point. So one way we can do this is to just visually look at it. I'll show you another way in a moment. But it looks like when we move from this point to this point, right, there's been an upward movement of about 50. And then even if we went to the next point, there looks like there was an upward movement about 50 again. And so forth and so forth and so on. So if you take a look at this graph, as we move from point to point, right, point to point, there's been a shift upwards, right? The cost is changing by 50. And technically it's 50,000, but I'll just use the number 50 right now, and we'll talk about that when we get to the units. So as we move from point to point, the change in cost is $50,000 per, as we go along. So now, what about the units? Well, if we take a look at the units, right, we move from point to point, right, it looks like the number of units, right, we're changing here. It looks like we went over 100 and a little bit more. Looking at our scale, that's about half of 100 to 200, so 150. So it looks like we moved over 150 units. Let's see if that's still the same. So remember, that's 150. So as we move from this point to the other point, it looks like the amount I moved is 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, and lo and behold, it's 150. So you can kind of, again, see it's still, right, from 300 to this point, well, that's 300 to 450, that's another 150. So it looks like what we're changing, we're going in steps of 150 along the x-axis. So we have some zeros canceling out, and what we have 5 over 15, and of course that reduces, 5 going to itself once, and there 3 times, we're left with 1/3. 1/3 what? Well, again, remember the top is measured in thousands of dollars. So it looks like we have $1,000 per 3 units. Alright, so $1,000 per 3 units right now. Of course, we also know that this is 0.333 with the bar on it. So it looks like we're talking about roughly $330 and say 33 cents, right, per unit, if you wanted to even go that far. So a couple of ways to kind of think about that rate of change. But again, the idea from a graph is we're talking about two changing quantities. So I identify it, and then I figure out, how each quantity is changing, put them in a ratio, and get my units right. And the beauty about this, you can kind of see that the relationship between the costs and the units is a linear one. And one of the things you're starting to notice is that for a linear relationship, the rate of change is the same. It didn't really matter which 2 points I have, right? We have 50 and 150. 50 and 150, 50 and 150. All right, we could have even used, like we did in the last example, find a couple data points, like that one right there would be 150, 100, and then this one right there would be 450, 200, and we could have even used, right, the shifting from x to y and the x to y, right? So maybe I think of this as the change in y over the change in x now, that I'm kind of looking at it differently. Well, what's the change in y? Well, when I move from one data point to the other data point, right, we're going from 200 to 100, right? And as we be consistent with x, we're going from 450 minus 150. And if you do the math, on top we get 100, on the bottom we get 300, and lo and behold, there's your 1/3 yet again. So pretty cool thing about lines, it doesn't really matter how you calculate the rate of change. which two points you use. If you do it visually like I did, if you do it point from point like I did, it's going to be consistent. It's going to constantly be 1/3. So that should wrap up the idea of rate of change in section 3.4, and we've really started to build up the rate of change idea in the next section 3.5. So I'll see you guys in that. Again, keep practicing. Ask for some office hour time, some virtual Google Meet time if you need it, or pop your questions on Canvas. A lot of help out there. Really big idea. See you guys in the next video.